So again, picking up where we just left off, you have the cribriform plate or horizontal plate. And in lab, I'd want you to call that the cribriform plate. If we look here, we have right there the perpendicular plate. So it's running in a perpendicular fashion to the horizontal plate running this way. Okay, so that's your perpendicular plate right there. Later we'll see this bone down here is called vomer. That's its own bone, vomer. So that's it for the ethmoid. We end with perpendicular plate right there. Next bone is maxilla, is the upper jaw. Okay, and one feature you see is right there. You can't miss it. This big hook of bone, that is anterior nasal spine. We're on the anterior surface, we're in the nasal region, and that is your anterior nasal spine. The anterior nasal spine is right there. And let me just back up a second. So I left these out. These are your nasal bones up here. The left and right nasal bone. That's what we call the bridge of the nose, right? So if you break your nose, this is the bones you're breaking up here. All of this is cartilage, and obviously it's not shown, the nose itself. So that's your nasal bone. This is all maxillary or maxilla. Anterior nasal spine. This wavy ridge right there of the gum line going all the way around, that's called the alveolar margin. That's the alveolar margin of the maxilla. So this is your alveolar margin. Anterior nasal spine, alveolar margin. On the maxilla, if we go in an inferior view, these two plates of bone are your palatine processes. We call the hard palate. That's your palatine process. And if we look on the palatine process, these processes here, we will see an opening right there, okay, behind these two teeth, okay, right here in the front, right there. Again, we see these are the incisors here. Right behind it, there's an opening. There's a hole right there. That's called the incisive fossa. The incisive fossa. So we have the palatine bones, or palatine process. I should say palatine process, because the palatine bones are actually back here. Remember, the processes are named according to the bones they're going to. These are actually the palatine bones. This is the palatine process of the maxilla. Okay, and there's going to be a joint line right in here, a joint line. There's your incisive fossa. Looking at the skull in the eye orbit, if we have a superior orbital fissure, we have an inferior orbital fissure. That's going to be on the maxillary bone here. So we have the inferior orbital fissure. Again, we have the superior orbital fissure and the inferior orbital fissure. Now, remember on the frontal bone, we had the superior or supraorbital foramen, I should say, supraorbital foramen right here. Look at this under the eye orbit. We have an infraorbital foramen here underneath. Infraorbital foramen. So infra means below the orbit. We have a foramen. So we have an infraorbital foramen. And don't think too hard. Guess what nerve comes out of that hole? If it's the infraorbital foramen, it's a branch we're going to see called the nerve called the infraorbital nerve. And we'll look at that when we get to head and neck. We'll cover those nerves of the face. All right, zygomatic bone. There's your cheek. Remember, we had this, right? That's the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. This would be the frontal process of the zygomatic bone because it's going to the frontal bone. That's your frontal process of the zygomatic bone. And then right here, on the zygomatic bone, we're attaching to the maxilla. This process right here is called the maxillary process of the zygomatic bone, because we're going to the maxillary. Remember, the processes are named according to the bones they're going to, but it's of the bone you're on. So once again, frontal process, temporal process, maxillary process of the zygomatic bone. Okay, looking at changing course here, we're going to look at the mandible. Sorry about that. We're looking at the mandible. Okay, and there it is. Let me put the skull down. And here's the mandible here. Okay, let's go through the multiple parts of the jaw, the lower jaw, the mandible. There are three main parts to the mandible. We have the ramus. It says all of this, the ramus. A ramus is an arm-like extension of bone. Here's the body right here, the ramus and the body. So we have the ramus, the body, and then we have the angle right here. Okay, so we got this angled portion here. I don't think angle made it onto the list. No, so it's just the body of the mandible and the ramus. On the ramus, we have the mandibular condyle or condyle. Remember, that's what formed the TMJ joint or temporomandibular joint. That's its attachment point to the skull. Condyle. Coronoid process. Coronoid process. Coronoid. When a king or queen goes through a coronation, what is placed on their head? A crown. So corona means crown, oid means resemble. So coronoid, this is the crowning part of the mandible. That's the coronoid process. If you heard the term coronary arteries before, that's the same situation. We're crowning the heart with blood vessels. So any crown or something on top of is corona. In this case, we have coronoid process here. Mandibular condyle or condyle. Coronoid process, mandibular notch, mandibular notch. Condyle, coronoid process, mandibular notch, ramus, body. On the chin, the term for chin is mental. There is the hole right there called the mental foramen. So that's your mental foramen. If we look on the inside of the ramus, we're going to see a hole right there. That is your mandibular foramen. That is your mandibular foramen. In fact, when you go to the dentist and you get a nerve block, if they can block sensory from this nerve to the brain, then this portion of the lower jaw is anesthetized. So that is your mandibular foramen. And again, we'll look at with the cranial nerves what's coming through here. It's actually your branch of your trigeminal nerve again, we'll look at later. So that is your mandibular foramen. Do not get these confused. We have mental foramen here, mandibular foramen there. Next to the mandibular foramen, we can see it best here. Again, we're looking at it on the inside of the mandible. We have a little tongue-like piece of bone. Let's see if we can see it this way. This little hood right there that covers over the mandibular foramen. That little hood of bone right there is your lingula. That's the lingula. And if we look on the inside of the jaw, right here, we see this spine right here sticking up. That's your mental spine, the mental spine. It's this point sticking up here. So once again for the mandible, ramus, body, condyle, coronoid process, mandibular notch, mental foramen, mandibular foramen, lingula, mental spine. Okay, mental spine. And that takes care of all of the structures of the mandible. Okay, the last couple bones we're going to look at are here. All right. Remember, this was the perpendicular plate of ethmoid. Here's vomer right here. Vomer, that's the vomer bone. It's its own bone. Okay. If we look at from underneath, remember these were the palatine processes of the maxilla, but down here, those are the palatine bones. And if we look at the palatine bones, left and right, you'll see there's a big hole right there, greater palatine foramen, greater palatine foramen. Okay, so again, palatine bones, greater palatine foramen. If we look at the skull in the eye orbits, we're going to see a very thin bone right here on the medial side of the eye orbit, and right here. That is your lacrimal bone. That is your lacrimal bone. Not on the list, but you actually have a hole, if you can see right there, called the lacrimal fossa. Okay, where tears are able to drain down into the nasal cavity. So that is your lacrimal fossa, but not on the list. So there's your lacrimal bone here and here.